So this week I seem to have been bombarded with social media advertising for an organisation you might have heard of called the Labour Party. And I find it quite mystifying because usually social media adverts are like in your head in a worrying way, right? You've barely thought of somewhere that you might want to go on holiday before you're getting hit with cheap flights to that place, cheap accommodation in that place, buy treatment for the medical condition you're most likely to pick up in that place. But these adverts, each one I see makes me less and less likely to vote for the Labour Party. This one is from Instagram, and they're saying the Labour Party is the party of law and order. And I don't even enjoy the TV show Law and Order, so I'm not entirely sure that you've done your demographic research correctly. But the advert itself is full of not only things I don't want, and indeed things that are essentially untrue, but it's also just buying into a media narrative that is misleading and dangerous. So they say they want to prevent crime by putting 13,000 more neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs on the street. Okay, the role of police is not to prevent crime. The role of police is to respond to crime. You should call them after the crime has happened and they come and arrest people and sort the situation out. If police are trying to intervene before crime takes place, that means we are leaving it to the police to guess who looks a bit crimey. And we all know what organisations like the Metropolitan Police think looks a bit crimey. And the police have this horrendous history of stop and search policies that disrupt lives and effectively criminalise people who are behaving in an entirely lawful way. They have a horrendous history of hundreds in recent years of strip searches on children, including the notorious Child Q case. And the last thing that we want is more of that. And the last thing we want is more of the police committing crime, which is what that amounts to. Secondly, the idea that putting police on the streets is what will prevent crime buys into this narrative that crime is something that takes place on the streets, and it overwhelmingly isn't. The vast majority of crime that takes place these days takes place in one of these environments, online, where everything from, hate speech and harassment and bullying all the way through to child grooming and distribution of illegal images and things like that, really horrific stuff is taking place. It overlooks rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, and lots of crimes like that, which overwhelmingly take place behind closed doors in homes and residential places. You can't have police officers wandering through bedrooms looking out to see if there's any crime going on. We have to build our response to those crimes based on a reporting system, based on believing victims and listening to victims and attempting to get prosecutions pushed through in a much more effective way. And it also overlooks corporate crime. Employers treating their employees in ways that are not safe and are not legal, people being ripped off, consumers getting products that are not safe for them, that are not in line with what they've said about them, advertising that is misleading, and also companies sequestering away money, avoiding tax, building shell company on shell company on shell company in order to prevent themselves from having to pay a reasonable amount of tax to contribute to our society, and indeed then using those structures to siphon profits off and accumulate wealth effectively because they run as monopolies and are not challenged, and because corruption is going on and bribery and all that kind of stuff is taking place, and almost nothing is being done about that. And there's no suggestion that the Labour Party are offering to get more people and more prosecutors to chase that kind of crime. Now, next up, they say that they're going to bring in tougher sentencing for antisocial behaviour. Now, firstly, tougher sentencing does not prevent crime. I mean, that just logistically makes sense. There are not criminals out there going, well, let's burgle this house. Hold on, Larry. I thought, it was a good idea when it was only going to be 6 months in prison, but now you tell me it's going to be 8.5 months. Well, I'm not risking it. That extra 2.5 months, that's going to clash with when the new season of Test cricket starts. That's not how it's going to work, is it? It's never worked like that. There's an issue of will you get caught, but there's no issue of what the sentencing is, and it even bears out in the fact that countries around the world with the longest and most draconian sentences, in fact, also have some of the highest rates of crime. It simply does not work as a preventative. But also, if we must bring in draconian longer sentences, why are we doing it? for antisocial behaviour. What is antisocial behaviour? Protesters who are deemed to have made too much of a noise, youths hanging around on street corners, people making, sounding the horn in a built-up area. Antisocial behaviour is a hugely arbitrary measure, and while there are definitely times when I do want people to get a rap over the knuckles if they've done something that makes life very inconvenient for other people, I don't feel reassured knowing that these people will be locked up for years and years and years. That's not helping me in the slightest. That is tying into this myth that the most dangerous criminals in our society are those engaging in antisocial behaviour. It's really not. If anything, the most dangerous people in our society are those people who are trying to offer an alternative to the Conservative Party's horrendous mismanagement of the country. And the best they can come up with is this kind of buying in to media narratives about crime and punishment and law and order. And if that really is the message of the Labour Party, then we need a new movement that actually cares about people, because there are so many great messages that the Labour Party could be climbing on board with right now, right? Thousands of people around the UK are worried about the cost of living, or as I prefer to call it, the cost of greed. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how we can reduce energy bills. Let's talk about how we can make sure people can afford to feed their families. Let's talk about how we can make sure that people can afford the healthcare and the education and all of those things that they need. Let's talk about how we can make sure that the health service doesn't fall apart, because it is at breaking point and we are absolutely at risk of losing what I believe is the greatest thing about the UK, and arguably one of the greatest things in the world, the National Health Service. Let's talk about how we can scrap tuition fees. Let's talk about how we can bring about peace in Ukraine and other places around the world. Let's talk about how we can end the arms trade. Let's talk about what we can do about climate change and the climate emergency, and what we can do to make sure that future generations have a planet that is livable. Let's be a Labour Party that takes the side of nurses and teachers and says these people are important in our society and they have a right to earn a wage that rises in line with inflation, to be able to feed their families and to continue to do the vitally important work that they do, and to be able to recruit enough colleagues to make their jobs viable. Surely there are better messages that the Labour Party could be pushing at me. Either fire your social media team, or effectively you fire the rest of us from being able to support you as an alternative to the horrors that we've suffered through with the Tories for the last so many years. See you next week.